Welcome to Community Focus here on Channel 6 TV. I'm Kenny Fogle. Glad you could be with us tonight. And I've been having a sort of a revelation lately, sort of looking back on our past, because we think about Nelson County today and where we are today. And a lot of times we only see a snapshot in time, and that's okay, because we know what's going on today, and hopefully we know a little bit of what's going on tomorrow. But how do we get here? I mean, that is the big question. How do we get here from the mid to late 1700s all the way up to today, and what makes Nelson County the great place it is to live, work, and everything else that we do here? And I think it's been fascinating me recently to think about all the people that's come before us. And I brought Dixie Hibbs in here with us today. Dixie is the #1 historian for this area, that knows this area inside out, and people who's here today that's related to people years ago. And so we're going to pick her brain here tonight and basically talk about some interesting people that have made Nelson County the wonderful place that it is today, because it just didn't happen.
Well, you know, there's a word called notoriety, where you're notorious. Well, a lot of people get to be notorious doing headline grabbing things,
Yeah.
but in the reality of life, notoriety is good because people know your name, they know what you've done, and positive and negative things you've done. And when we look back in history, those who have the most notoriety are usually those who have left their projects or their piece of their actions has been very beneficial for Nelson
When we
County.
think about notoriety, I mean, obviously we'll get into it in maybe a future episode of the history of Jesse James and Nelson County and people of that nature. But there's been some people that's went through that have got notoriety for doing some tremendous things.
Very positive things.
And we've got one we want to talk about today.
Well, I did some research this fall on a member of the Bardstown United Methodist Church, and we were doing our history. And one of the main people in our history is Judge Wallace Brown. Wallace Brown was born in Bloomfield area in Nelson County in 1874. His father had been a Confederate soldier, which many people were here. He was raised in a Methodist family of hardworking farmers, and he went on to go to public school. He went to the local schools, and then he went on to Kentucky Wesleyan in Winchester and Center College in Danville. Well, even today, if you get to Center College in Danville, you know you're getting a higher education.
Right.
He studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1912. But I have to go back. Before he was admitted to the bar, he had already been elected our circuit court clerk. He was elected the circuit court clerk in 1897, and he started a political career which spanned more than 50 years. Now, you may feel like politicians last more than 50 years, but he truly contributed to the community from the time he was elected circuit court clerk in 1897. He came to Bardstown, he moved to Bardstown, and he became a member of the Bardstown Methodist Church. He was consulted about many of the things in the church. He was a very smart person. He wasn't one who, he filled a leadership role without pushing himself forward.
Yeah.
If you understand what I'm saying there. He was elected to delegate to the Methodist General Council in Jackson, Mississippi in 1934, and that was the highest honor a layman could do at that point. He joined the church here in Bardstown in 1898, and he went every week, sometimes twice, often twice. He was known throughout his life as a thrifty, honest, sincerely religious, and conservative man.
Politician. That's not the definition of a politician today. You know that, don't you?
Well, you know, I'd love to have something like that put on my tombstone kind of thing, because it really makes you stop and think all of those things. He was elected the circuit clerk, as I mentioned, state representative, state senator, and county judge, which he held the county judge position for 23 years. A total of 43 years in public service. Now, the memories of the Bardstown Church's congregation in the 50s and 60s, which I was a member there, are filled with images of an older man. And this older man would be in church every Sunday. We would go to Sunday school, and then we would go up into the sanctuary, and he would sit back in the first pew as you came in from the front door on the left. And you always knew he was going to be there. You know, in your own church, you know who's going to sit there.
Everybody got assigned seats.
And as a child, and in the 1950s, I was anywhere from 10 to 15, 16 years old. I noticed him and I spoke to him. My parents taught me to be polite.
Yeah.
Had no idea how important he was and all, but I knew that he always dressed in a dark suit, and he had his hair combed back kind of, he was balding a little bit, he combed it over like you do there, and he always had stark black hair.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, boy, that poor old man, he's got this black hair, how'd he do that? Well, we figured out how he did it. The rumor was that he would put black shoe polish on his hair to dye it, you know, in the gray. And when it got too hot in the church, we're in the 1950s, no churches were air conditioned. And you would look over and little streaks of black would be running down the back of his neck. And as a child, we just thought that was hilarious on this part. But he had a sense of pride and a sense of his image that, you know, he wanted to show. Mm-hmm. He married, had 2 sons, and all during this time his wife was very supportive of him. She died in the 1920s, though. He was without a helpmate for quite a number of years, yes. But he had, his attitude was he lived his life the way that he believed. Mm-hmm. And as a politician, you know, that word is becoming almost a 4-letter word, you know, kind of thing. But he represented the people, all the people, even to the point he was so conservative that when it came time to fix the courthouse, the roof would leak or he had to do some work, he would do the work instead of taking the taxpayers' money. That's a conservative area there. But he was, he heard a lecture about the things that make for a good life. He had heard this lecture, and he was mulling over what he had done in his life. In 1955, he was already, 55 and 75 years old. Yeah. And he wrote to his sons, let me read this. I tried to see if my activities of past years were along these lines. After some frivolities of early teen years and before leaving for college, and then more than 43 years in office, founding paper, building roads, happily married life before the age of 30, active church religious services for nearly 60 years. These things have afforded me a happy life, and my greatest happiness has come from helpful services to others. Possibly my present health in 82 years is largely due to the manner of my living. Now, the idea that what's the word I want to say? His confession of frivolities in the early teens.
Yeah, I'd like to know what they were.
That was, well, it probably had everything from knocking men's hats off their heads to stealing apples or whatever. But Judge Brown was a people's judge, a people's person, and he was an excellent, excellent example. And when you talk to people in the Methodist Church, they all have their Judge Brown stories. And one of which came out of our conversation back in the fall was when one of the pastors decided not to have Wednesday night service anymore. And Judge Brown had been coming to Wednesday night services for 50 years. And so he continued to come. He would come and sit on the front steps as his protest that they weren't having services anymore. But the best story in the Methodist Church about Judge Wallace Brown is the fact that he saw a need and he fulfilled it. The Bardstown Methodist Church was built in 1856, solid brick construction on stone foundation, no basement. We needed room for Sunday school rooms, for meetings and all, and Judge Brown was a widower. He had his political life and he was busy. But he determined that he could dig this basement. Now you have to understand this building's standing there. You're not going to move the building, build the basement and all. So he gets a mule and he gets a scoop. And a scoop is like a wheelbarrow without the wheels, so to speak. Yeah. You've tied your ropes or your cables to the scoop and pull the dirt out. Well, he worked part-time. It took him quite a while, but he scooped enough dirt out from under the Methodist Church to complete a basement. And today you can go down there, see the original foundation stone wall, how far it went, and then you come in about 18 inches, and there's where the basement stops. Can you imagine Judge Brown, his mule and scoop?
He wasn't wearing a black suit, I don't guess.
Not at that point, not at that point. But he came up with the idea, he figured out how to do it, and he accomplished it.
Well, you know, and just slipping away from this, we'll come back to his political career. He was one of the founders of the Kentucky Standard.
That's what I was going to say. I knew I'd forgotten to speak that. Yes, he was interested in the paper early on. He, I think it's 1905 or 10, somewhere. And I'm sorry I don't have that. But he, as I mentioned, he was intelligent, educated, and he knew the value of the written word. He had to use that written word all the time in his office, whether he was circuit clerk or senator and all of that. And so he supported that, and then the Watson family finally bought him out. Right. And I think part of that was when he became county judge. It was a little bit of a problem, conflict.
You give yourself some good editorials.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wrote some good editorials. He was on that part. He was, another story I heard is during Prohibition, he was the judge that they brought the arrested for moonshiners and the rum runners in before him. And he had a whole schedule of what the fines and the punishment was. And he held it to it. But sometimes when there were families involved, or he realized the situation, he would work that out to where the fine could be paid off in farm produce and something that helped the family. Because Prohibition here in Bardstown was terrible, in Nelson County. It was terrible for everybody. But he was a judge with a heart, as was the jailer, Lud McKay. Because when Lud McKay had someone in his jail that had been caught with illicit goods, on Christmas Day, he let him go home for Christmas Day to his family because he knew he'd come back. And no one ever stood Lud McKay.
Well, I got to confess, I had a grandfather that served weekends. They let him work during the week, and he'd come in on weekends.
Weekend. Well, you know, justice comes in all forms. And I wonder sometimes that someone like Judge Brown looking down how much money that's being spent on everything, but it's all relevant to what you get back. It's not a question of how much money, it's what it buys or what the proceeds that come from it, the advantages there. But he's just one religious man who served mostly as a mentor and an example on that part. So if you hear somebody talk about Judge Brown, well, now you got a little more information.
Absolutely. Like I said, you've got a picture of him, I know, in one of the books that we were looking at earlier. And I just trying to picture a guy like him in fiscal court. His temperament is exactly how he would react to.
One of the things I think you have to remember, he was a farmer. He was brought up on a farm. He was brought up to work with his hands, and also to be patient. You know, if you're a farmer, you have to be patient. I'm not a farmer, but I do know you've got to deal with the weather, deal with things you have no control over. And I think that's part of all of that. And I don't know of any situation where he and his magistrates got sideways, but there's always differences of opinion.
Well, politics throughout has been very colorful in Nelson County over the past many years. You can go back and point at several instances that are good, bad, ugly, whatever you want to call them. And for a person to persevere like that in that environment, it has to be difficult.
23 years as county judge.
Exactly.
How many terms is that? 5.5?
Yeah, something like that.
5.5 terms. And you know, you think about how he always was properly dressed and had the right manner, but as you said, he didn't wear his black suit while he's digging the basement out. But there again, he has descendants. Most of them are not here. The last I understood, they were in Florida, I think. But he was kin to a lot of families here in Nelson County, and his wife, like that.
Well, like I said, this is the kind of stuff that fascinates me. Growing up here in Nelson County, we don't learn a lot of history of Nelson County. We learn history of the world. We know Abraham Lincoln was from Kentucky and went through here. We know, like I mentioned, Jesse James and people like that. But people right here next door to us that have had such an influence on our life and our community. Our roads, I know he was very influential in a lot of roads.
Well, the county roads. And then, like I said, he understood the needs. Since he, you know, whether it was somebody that had to have a wagon road to get their produce to market, or whether the situation of jobs, even then they worked hard to try to bring jobs here. The other people that we are going to be talking about, because once you start talking about we call them the movers and the shakers now.
Right.
But they're kind of that way then. They were the ones who would step up, and there were some, in the book I did on Prohibition, in reading through it, there were people who stood up then and provided stability, and whether that's leadership too. But the stability is knowing that you could go to somebody and they would help you, or they would try to give you good advice to where you didn't get yourself into big.
Well, like I said, I only want to go back and sometimes because there's people's names like Isaac Cox, Ben Hardin, Ben Johnson, people of that nature that we don't talk about or we don't know a whole lot about. And so we run into Wallace Brown. We want to do him first because. Right. He seemed to have I don't say the biggest impact, but you know, quite an unusual man.
Well, but he was probably one of the least known of those that you mentioned, yes. Of course, Isaac Cox was early scout, we can talk about that, and Ben Hardin, we have a house that we remember him for, and Ben Johnson, we have lots of tales we can talk. One of the things I always thought was interesting, Ben Johnson, he was the first member of Congress to ever fly in an airplane. That's a trivia thing. That's the kind of thing you remember. Yeah. But the story goes that he was all scheduled to go up in the airplane, in a military airplane, and he got to the airport, and the weather wasn't too good. It wasn't storming, but the wind was blowing and cloudy, and the pilot didn't want to go up. And he said, "You agreed to take me up today at this time, and we're going to go up." Well, they went up, and when he came back down, he got out, and the pilot was shaking, and Johnson wasn't too happy, but he said, "Well, you did it and I did it, but we could have put this off, you know, kind of thing.
Well, I guess that's what they kind of say. You know, is Ben Johnson is the one I understand was sort of I used the word apple knocker back in those days, and you had Wallace Brown that had to deal in that environment.
And he actually was a contemporary of Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was born in 1855, I think, right before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And but he was in politics early. Now he was a congressman. He went to Frankfurt, but he also then went on to Washington, and he spent 25 years in Congress. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of time in Congress too. So, but when he came back here, here's Wallace Brown, who's county judge, and even today, all of the politicians and all of the people interested. Let's quit using politicians. All the people interested in furthering opportunities and situations within their area. Yeah. Get together and they talk. They always used to call them backroom deals and all this. You have to talk. You have to be aware of all the ins and outs. You know yourself, and we all talk about what's going on and how we can work with it or how we can try to change it, whatever. And that was happening. And these leaders and their personalities are one of the things that we talked about. We'll talk some more about some of the stories. And anything that we are talking about is written in history. I'm not making anything up. Yeah. So if somebody says, "Oh, that didn't happen," well, let me tell you where you can go find it, kind of thing. Because there's some, they're not fake news. They are
alternative. I don't want to use that word either.
Alternative facts, not exactly. No, they are lesser known. I like that. They are lesser known parts of history of all of these people, and whether it's that they might have cheated at cards, or they might have had an argument and shot somebody, or whatever. That's lesser known news. Yeah. But it's all part of the whole story.
Yeah, well, it's like the book, you put out a book, it was a synopsis of many headlines in the Kentucky Standard over the first 100 years. Yeah. And I use that book a lot to go back, and that's how I read a lot about Wallace Brown and different people. I found my dad's picture in there. How he got in a picture was unreal with the people that were at Barton's at the time, because he was barely one of the first employees working there. But it's just fascinating going back reading some of these, because there's people's names that have not heard of who I've talked to you about off the air, and we'll talk about some later on in some future episodes. But Wallace Brown, again, you say you knew him in his older years, I think he passed away in 1960.
70 something, I think.
Oh, so I thought it was 1964.
Maybe 64. Maybe it's me thinking.
Because I'm trying to remember if I'd ever met him, so I'd only been about 9 years old at the time.
Well, and really I should know this too.
So I did look that
1960, he's still writing, so he's still alive then. I thought it was 73 for some reason.
Okay, well, I don't know where I saw I saw 64 somewhere.
You're probably right.
I was trying to determine if we'd ever crossed paths. I know I went to the Monks many times. We can talk about Thomas Merton someday. I've always wondered if I met Thomas Merton, because we went to the Monks every Saturday when I was a kid during that time period, so I just wonder. But I know Wallace Brown, he had on something about his glass spectacles. Oh,
yes, he had the glass with the little gold rims and all of that. And they have those at the Methodist Church in a nice cabinet. There's several things that are left to the church that belong to him. One was those gold spectacles kind of thing. That way. He was, you were talking about Thomas Merton. I met Thomas Merton at Hawk Rogers Restaurant.
Oh, really?
Now, that for those of you that don't know, Hawk Rogers at a restaurant on South 4th Street.
Colonel
Hawk's, and it was the place to go for really good food. It was usually open every night, but usually Friday and Saturday nights you're really busy. And you took your own bottle because he didn't have a liquor license. And he fried the best shrimp in the whole world that way. But that's a lot of people would go there and take their friends or their visitors there. And that's the first time and last time that I saw Thomas Merton was there. I saw him a couple of times. The only reason I even knew who he was, the monks during the 1950s and 60s, we would identify the monks because they had crew haircuts. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds strange, but most adult men didn't walk around with their head shaved. And that was one, and then they also walked around often in, is it coveralls or straps, like overalls, or whichever.
I always call them coveralls.
With the denim coveralls and things. And so it was kind of a, just, you look at him and think, oh, I bet that's a monk, kind of deal.
Well, there had to be some interesting conversations going on. I can imagine that Colonel Hawks having Thomas Merton, Wallace Brown, all these people, if they ever got together at one time, it'd be an interesting room to sit in.
that would be an interesting play to write.
Oh, my goodness, couldn't you imagine?
Yes, Nelson County, the angel sitting up there from Nelson County that had a a role in forming all these things, whether it was roads or religion or
Well, you mentioned the
musical
angels. I said there's a few little devils mixed in there too.
You give everybody the benefit of a doubt.
Okay, we'll do that.
Okay. That's probably why I'm not a politician.
All right.
That way. But I'd be glad to come back and we'll talk again about some of the others. I have
Yeah.
some favorites, and I have some that were instrumental in the longest running, no, that's not a good word, running, the longest serving mayor in Bardstown.
Simpson? No. Okay.
Cisco.
Now,
John.
see, now I got to go read another book.
John Cisco.
Don't know much about him at all.
Well, he started his career in 1897, and he was mayor to 1930. He was mayor when all of the, mostly the electrical, he was on the city council when the electricity came.
Yeah.
And he was the leader when we got sewer and water, telephone, better telephone downtown. We already had it, but he worked to get a better deal. But the sewer and water and electric service all came about through his leadership. My Kentucky Home opened. All of the prohibition went along through this. I mean, if he had kept a diary or something, I would love to have seen it because he was really here through all the grand things that happened in Bardstown.
Well, that's like I said, it's fascinating, the people that come before us. And today we're introducing you to Judge Wallace Brown, and hopefully we learn a little bit more about him today. And as time goes on, Dixie and I are going to sit here, and I'm going to learn. I'm learning as quick as you are because some of the things I'm asking her are brand new information to me, and I'm hoping that we can all learn together because we're just, it's wonderful that we have these great people, and like I said, some maybe not so great, but that's who we are. So again, Dixie, I appreciate you coming in here and telling us a little bit about some of our ancestors, and we're going to learn a little bit more as time goes on.
Well, I'll try to think up some interesting ones, and I'll certainly bring you some stories about women. Women had a big role.
Well, that is one of the things I want to talk about. We're
women.
talking to the first woman mayor of Bardstown right now, so obviously we're making history just on.
We had quite a few women who often you talk about the women behind the man, so to speak, and when you talk about Ben Johnson, his wife was very, very respected and listened to and all. And he might not have listened to her, but in the reality of life that she...
Well, I understand the John Fitch thing is to her dedicated. Basically, she did.
That's right, she did. She led the charge, so to speak.
And I don't know much about John Fitch, so that's another guy we can talk about.
We certainly can.
We got all kinds of people to talk about.
Well, it'll take us a year to get through this.
No, that's good. I like talking about people. It's not really gossip either.
No. And if it will encourage people to go and read about history, if anything we say or do causes you to become interested or wanting to know more, we have lots of great history books, and we have lots of sources. Our libraries, our video, our microfilm collections, and internet. We have a tremendous amount of ways to learn. And when you learn about Nelson County history, that's a value that will serve you when you're talking to your family and other people, and you'll understand what goes on now when you think about what came before.
It is fascinating. We're not just old buildings. We've got a history, we've got a story behind them all.
All of it.
So I actually had to go look a couple of them up. They'd name a building in the book, and I said, I wonder what building that is. I passed it 30, 40, 50 times a week, and I still don't know what the name of it was and why it was named that way.
Well,
but after you study, you find out.
You'll have to show me your cheat sheet, and I'll tell you what's right and wrong.
All righty. Well, Dixie Hibbs here with us today, talking about a little history going on. Judge Wallace Brown is our subject today, and we're going to be back with more history about Nelson County. So if you like history, tune us in. Hopefully you'll learn something. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. That's the whole point for me is I'm enjoying this more than I'm learning it. But at the same time, education doesn't hurt anybody. So stick around. A lot more to come here on Channel 6 Community Focus. Be right back here in just a few minutes.